Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're just going to wait a moment while the Zoom room fills up. We had 640 registrants for today's webinar, which shows a huge amount, I think, of interest in the retrospective on 2020 and the outlook for 2021. For those of you who have been on one of our webinars previously, you'll notice that it is Zoom rather than GoToWebinar. And in part, that was driven by your feedback, particularly for some participants who struggled with some of the audio and connectivity. So we'd love your feedback just generally on the webinar and webinar series, but also on whether you find this to be a better experience for you. Just hold on a couple more seconds while the room fills up. And we're running slightly ahead of time as well. So again, as it was previously, and thank you again for everyone who attended any of our webinars last year, you will be in mute by default, but we do want to hear from you. So you're on mute so that other participants and audience members don't get their sound quality disrupted by background noise, but we do want to hear from you. So through the Zoom control panel, you're able to ask questions. They will then be moderated by one of my colleagues, and we have 15 minutes allocated at the end to answer any questions. And thank you to everyone who has already submitted questions, quite a lot around what the government's intentions are in respect to the private rented sector, and some relatively nuanced ones for David as well. So today we are having a look at what the key, what some of the key things that happened through 2020 and an outlook for 2021. One of the phrases that has been oft used over the last year is that pandemics are lived forwards but understood backwards, and life itself is lived forwards and understood backwards. We're going to pick out some of the key and salient points that Zoe, an operator, David, a lawyer, and Trevor, I guess at the pinnacle of prop tech in the UK, have found over the last year. And we're going to look at some of the key changes and challenges and in fact opportunities that are coming down the pipeline for 2021. And with that, I would like to move on to our disclaimer. So as usual, everything here is for general information purposes only, and it specifically is not and must not be construed as legal advice or official guidance. For anyone who wants specific legal guidance, David's contact details will be available at the end of the webinar. And moving on to our esteemed panel. So I would love for you to all introduce yourself to the audience in alphabetical surname order. So starting with Zoe, please.
Hi, good morning, everybody. As you can see, my name's Zoe Bywater. I'm the Director of Lettings for Belvoir Bedford, a franchise I've been running for the past 18 years. I'm also level 4 qualified and a member of the ALA board. However, I must stress that all the opinions today are mine and mine only.
Very good. Another disclaimer. We love disclaimers. David, on to you, please.
I'll do a disclaimer-free intro. My name's David Smith. I'm a partner at JMW Solicitors, and apparently I know one or two things about private sector lettings law.
Excellent. A modest introduction. And Trevor.
Hi folks, I'm Trevor Youens. I'm Director of Residential Solutions here at MRI Software. We're a software house delivering to the corporate real estate and agency sector. To be described as at the pinnacle of prop tech is probably overstating it somewhat. We probably would be better off with a goat on this call, but I'll do my best.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much, and thank you all for taking out the time for today's webinar. So here's a synopsis of the themes we're going to run through, but I'd like to start with a retrospective. So looking back on 2020, what's your summary of 2020 for the letting sector? Zoe, would you like to kick us off on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, first things first, it was a year that we never expected. Words such as unprecedented, unpredictable, and the fact that we've all shown great resilience during difficult times. I think just briefly, we all now know about COVID risk assessments, PPE, social distancing and bubbles. We've seen the best and the worst come out of this industry, I think. And also we've now adapted our processes, and I'd probably say we rely on technology to assist us where we probably didn't need it in the past, but it's there to complement us rather than to replace. And just finally, question for me is this the end of the shop front and the high street office?
Nice provocative question to answer to end on. David, what's your synopsis of 2020?
Well, from a legal perspective, it's been quite exciting. We've obviously had a lot of excitement about things like data protection and business interruption insurance, which has all been led off Brexit. We've had a lot of challenges with things like repairs and getting access to property, and tenants wanting to leave, which have all generally made the news as well. I think the things that have certainly occupied me have been the ever-changing notice period requirements, and how much notice do you actually have to give a tenant on a specific day of the week, which always, of course, changes late on a Friday, which keeps my weekends interesting and makes my wife go a bit bonkers. We've had the court stay and the ever lengthening and adjusting and altering court stay, and then the new court working practices, which of course have just been extended again through to July this year. We've got the eviction process. We had informal bans on eviction. They then became formal bans on eviction. They're due to end at the end of March, but I think they'll probably be extended on some basis. We don't know what that'll be yet. So that's all happening as well. And then just before Christmas, I've already been criticised as some of the prequels on this for my obsession with this case, but the Northwood Solihull versus Ferns case, which I think is going to dominate life a little bit for a lot of agents as we move into the first part of 2021, about the signing of tenancy deposit protection certificates and whether agents operating as corporates and corporate landlords can sign these on the basis on which they have to do that signing. So that was a bit of pre-Christmas entertainment for those of you like me who think a bit of law over Christmas is the way to go.
I am also in that camp. Thank you, David. And Trevor, over to you. What was your take on 2020?
I mean, I'm picking up really on Zoe's point, because there's no point in me talking about Northwood versus Solihull or whatever, because that would be irrelevant. But, you know, the dependency on being able to drive people to work from home happened overnight. Now, you're talking about St. Patrick's Day last year. Everyone sat there and said, "It's fine, we'll see you in 2 or 3 weeks." And then we had this massive drive to get everyone into a more remote environment. And I don't think if we look back on it, we would have realised quite how easy it is to have made that transition into a more remote working place. Now, the longer term, who knows? Going back to Zoe's point again, is the high street dead? I think that's a real tough question. I came from an agency background. Everyone knows will know that 20 years in and around agency. And, you know, the key driver still, whenever you send out questionnaires to people, why do you use a certain agent? What is it that drives you to that agent? Still, the top 2 replies are still generally board presence and office. So it's an interesting question about whether we've reached at that point where you can genuinely do the whole thing remotely. I'm not convinced. I still think you need that presence, but we can talk about it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, brief synopsis of 2020 covered. I find it astonishing that approximately 50 weeks ago, I was at Twickenham watching a rugby match with about 70,000 people, and that just would feel completely alien. So looking forward to 2021, David, turning to you. What are the key legal changes that are set to come about this year that agents should be aware of?
Right, well, I'll try and do them roughly in day order. I mean, I think data protection will continue to be a big issue throughout the coming year. We've got challenges associated with Brexit and how and sort of creating a new UK data protection regime carved out of a European regime. There's been a massive increase in cyber security breaches. There's been a massive increase in people making complaints and subject access requests to agents. So I think people really need to start, improving their game in this. And that's not just in the agented sector, that's across the board, but state and letting agents have a lot of work to do in this area, in my view. We've got, as I've already hinted at, the notice period extensions are meant to end in March. I don't think they will. The new court working processes run through to July now. I think the notice periods will be extended. I think you're going to have to look at eviction bans. I think they may well be extended as well. We'll then have to see what happens in July. I think it's pretty likely that they'll go on beyond there as well, to be honest. We've got the new debt breathing space regs coming into effect in May, which I think will make some changes in terms of rent arrears. We've got the EICR requirement going to all tenancies on the 1st of April. And then eventually, somewhere, presumably in the latter part of the year, the Renters Reform Bill. And just because I like mentioning it, the Northwood Solihull case at some point this year will hit the Court of Appeal. And then on top of that, of course, you've got the unpredictable. So the government's bound to do something in regulations that nobody reasonably expected. And there's bound to be at least one important case that that causes everyone a bit of stress.
Thank you, David. So it sounds like a huge amount's coming down the track, and you've got the unknown unknowns of what may also be thrown into the mix. The law, I think, is intended to be stable so people can, and predictable so that people can plan and make decisions. I guess, what can the agents on today's call do or look at if they want to keep abreast of the changes that are coming? Where would you direct them for updates on legal changes?
I think this is the problem, is it is difficult to get updates. I mean, I follow a whole range of sources. The MHCLG does a free monthly update service, which is worth subscribing to. In fact, you can get daily updates from them if you're crazy enough. But you can get it set at different intervals. I recommend looking at that because it does tell you about the statutory stuff. Other than that, you need to pick your trusted sources. I mean, clearly I'm going to say that I tend to write blog posts on a lot of these things, and you can find them through my social channels. So you need to look for a group of sources. I wouldn't say there's one single source. It's difficult to just find a single trusted resource. Obviously, people should look to their professional bodies and associations, but they themselves have limits in terms of their size, their reach, their spend, and of course they all have their own purpose as well, which may not always accord with yours. So it's difficult to find one place. You just have to keep abreast. I think the key thing to think about, and I'm sure other people are going to say this, is get strong, clear policies and good governance in place. And there's still time to do that in some of the sort of quieter fallow periods that associate with lockdown. And then you need to stay flexible.
Thank you, David. Zoe, I'd like to sort of step into operational and sort of real world agency. So how have you maintained your responsiveness and service levels with landlords and occupiers through the pandemic? And what changes have you made to your business during the pandemic that you'll keep even when it comes to an end? So what's here to stay in your business?
I think just one point to start with, I was very, very lucky that prior to all of this, I systemised my processes and got everything in place, and had a really good team behind me that were well motivated for any changes, because people don't like change, and there was a lot of changes that we had to make. One of the key things we learned during the lockdown was that communication is key. And when I say communication, what I mean by that is picking up the phone and speaking to people. There are a lot of people who are very, very worried and scared about what was happening. So we kept that communication going, but we also had technology supporting us in the background that allowed us to spend more time doing that. That we will keep doing. And a lot of the things went virtual. We were lucky, we were ready and literally switched from office to home working within 12 hours because we already had that technology in place. I do believe that the virtual side of things will stay. It will weed out the time wasters, the tire kickers, and it will make a business, I think, more efficiently run because of that, because you can build on the communication. I think with all of it, there's so much to say. We increased our social media coverage, and I think you've got to continue to do that and be consistent with it, whilst also, I say, keep reassuring people and sharing information. I mean, the difficulty is accessing that information and getting the right information. So you have to get it from the most appropriate sources and not from Karen.
Thank you. One of the things I'm hearing from clients is that social distancing, the pandemic more generally, has led to a higher level of qualification. So before going to meet someone in person and or taking them around a property, whether to let or to buy, there's a higher level of qualification. And I suspect that's something that will stick through this. So better, I guess, due diligence on applicants I suspect is here to stay. But whether the market stays at that norm remains to be seen. Trevor, so we've looked at legal, we've looked at operational. Now I'd love for you to bring some data insight. So what are you seeing across MRI's systems? What trends are you seeing across the wider market that you can shed some light on?
It's interesting because I was chatting to Zoe about this in terms of people would say, oh, you know, our arrears going up and stuff like that. I sort of bundled away last week and ran a few figures, and we don't see a huge increase in arrears and defaults, you know, when compared to the same period, say last year. So that's an interesting one. We aren't seeing that. That maybe could be obviously a knock-on effect of furloughing and so on. So that isn't featuring hugely. There is definitely a drop-off in rent levels. So somewhere around the sort of 8% generically across the country, probably slightly higher in central London, in prime London. So we're definitely seeing that. But again, you know, it's not something that we're seeing as causing huge issues. The massive one is the squeeze on agents' margins. So when we talk about the fact that so much has changed, so much more regulation coming in, we are definitely seeing that, you know, fees are under pressure. And it does lend itself more back towards the question around how you work with your portfolio, how you work with your tenants and landlords. Again, to Zoe's point, I think you need to look at your pinch points. There's a huge amount of prop tech out there, and I'll talk more about it later in terms of not specifically, but you know, what's worth it, what's not. But the pinch points in your processes are the ones where you've got to look at maybe tech solutions to help you with some of the areas of need, whether it's onboarding, whether it's deposit release, whether it's maintenance. They're probably the ones that you should look at, turn more to technology to try and take away some of the person-heavy processes that are in place. So that's what we're certainly seeing some of the bigger agency groups focus on, and quicker as well. I mean, there's always been this talk around, oh, we should do this, or we should look at these solutions, or we should maybe change our processes. The speed at which people had to react to this has meant that we've definitely seen more of those longer term projects being rolled in as solutions to needs in those sort of areas, really.
Thanks, Trevor. I think it's an interesting point that you started off with there in terms of the arrears level. I think it's yet to be seen quite what the impact of the taper off or end of furlough is going to bring in terms of people's ability to pay rents or even service charge or equivalents. And the budget that's coming up, and we're probably going to touch on some of the potential tax changes, is going to be critical, I think, in terms of the road to recovery. Just as a reminder, please, if you've got any questions, please do put them into the Q&A box. We've got time allocated at the end, so we'll try and get through as many of the themes that are raised, or in fact, even insights that you want to share with us as possible. Moving on to electrical safety. So this is something that is looming imminently, with just a few months to go until all tenancies, all properties with tenancies in England have to comply with EICR requirements. David, do you think there'll be a last minute grace period, or what's your take on the challenges? And I think we'll come to some of the operational challenges with Zoe, but do you think there'll be a grace period or an extension?
No. In summary, no, I don't. I've been pressing in various meetings with MHCLG for there to be an extension for ages, since last year, and they've fobbed us off at every turn, and they've now turned around and said that there is no parliamentary time available to put through any regulations to extend the grace, to extend time for compliance. Their position is, their part of their position is that actually, if landlords can't get access or can't reasonably get the work done, then that's a defence under the regulations, which isn't true. It isn't. There is no defence to not having a valid check in place under the regulations. There are defences if local authorities have served you notices requiring you to rectify defects, and you can't then do those. Remediation notices, that's the correct name for them. The MHCLG has told local authorities that they should be reasonable when issuing penalties. Whether that message has actually been received by local authorities is another matter. I can't say that it has, and the reality is that some local authorities will be more reasonable than others. The only thing I can say is I would advise everybody here to do absolutely everything they can to meet the deadline, or as close to it as possible. I suppose I should highlight, if you're an agent, at least, you're not actually liable, although I don't think that's particularly sensible approach to take as an agent. But if you've got landlords who are obstructing you in doing this, then that is their decision. They are the ones, and I have certainly encountered landlords with obstructing agents doing this themselves. They are the ones who will get it in the neck ultimately. But it's really important to get this done. I mean, there is a problem as well that the guidance is poorly worded, and I've certainly seen people pushing back against agents, suggesting that they don't have to do it, or they've got 28 days to get it done, and all kinds of rubbish that they've sort of pulled from badly worded guidance. But no, I mean, even if there was to be an extension at this stage, the reality is it will come so late, it will be academic for most people.
Thanks, David. From speaking with people across the industry, it feels like there is a bit of a mess, whether it's through landlord clients not understanding the requirements, or unavailability of contractors, or perhaps even a misunderstanding within some agencies about the requirements themselves. So I guess a number of loaded questions here for Zoe, which are, do you think that landlords are clear on the law? Are agents able to source contractors? How are you dealing with it in practice? How ready are homes?
Okay. Before I start, there are 4.85 million rented homes in England, and there was an article in the Electrical Times in December 2020 that said 50% of the UK has a shortfall of around 50 electricians based on job vacancies. So we just leave that out there. You know, it's obvious, it's clear that there are not enough electricians to carry out this element of work. Now, going on what you were saying about landlords being aware, I think that depends on the agent and the landlord. Unfortunately, here we're probably preaching to the converted. I would suggest that most people on this webinar today are prepared and have booked in and have got things under control. The unfortunate thing will be the ones that aren't here, the disengaged, which are the ones that we should be worried about. Now, even if we get the EICRs done, I think the biggest issue is going to be the amount of remedial work that needs to be carried out. And I think that's where the problem will lie, in getting that remedial work carried out in the appropriate timescale. But on the back of that, one of the key things is enforcement. Who's enforcing this? I know on a local level, there aren't enough officers within the local authority to deal with this, amongst all the other things. So, you know, it's a two things going on there. There's the work that needs doing, but then if it isn't done, who's enforcing it? Like I say, we're probably preaching to the converted here. And until we're all regulated as an industry, what do you do?
Thanks, Zoe. So we launched a couple of national contractor networks which cover things including EICRs, and I think we're about 8 days into the month, into day 9. I think we're ticking along at about 4,000 instructions, which I would say is a drop in the ocean across our client base. But I think a sign that my take is people came back from Christmas and this was top of their list, but actually the national lockdown, schools not reopening, and other things, as well as a higher prevalence of illness, whether from people at work, the agency directors, or members of their family, it suddenly went off the boil in terms of their hierarchy of needs. I think perhaps understandably so. I think this month we have seen a real refocus on getting EICRs done. I'd like to just sort of, I guess, move speed again. So Trevor, you work for a global business. Can you tell us how, I guess possibly from the multifamily or build to rent sector, how Britain is viewed as an investment sector post-Brexit? And are there any insights you can bring in terms of tenant demands from the social housing businesses that recently joined the MRI business?
Yeah, I mean, I always thought that if you mention the B word in this meeting, then I'd just leave and use it as an excuse to, like, say you've got no remit to talk about it or something. But I'm actually thinking now I should just qualify as an electrician, Zoe, because that might be the right approach to take going forward. Being glib about it, yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that there's still huge interest in the build-to-rent sector over here from the US. There's still investment going on, and if anyone watched the Devil Smith presentations last week, you know, it's still very much a driver, not only from US investment, but obviously pension funds here and other interested real estate partners that are very keen to drive the build-to-rent space. And I don't see that changing. I think I also don't see any lack of consolidation going on, certainly in the agency space, and that's something we're seeing a huge amount of, obviously with recent announcements as well, at mergers and acquisitions, and that's true in our space as well. So still a huge amount of activity around consolidation of providers in the space. So that's a more generic view. Social is really interesting. So different approach to the way you deal with customers and tenants. It's very much more driven by their requirements and their well-being, and we've got to have a very close focus on that particular sector of the market. One, because of the times we're in, but also generally, you know, we take a very different approach to the way we deal with our social clients. You know, telling, and it's not teaching anyone anything they don't already know, but a very telling stat is we've got a home swapper product that is tenant facing, and that's a big departure for us as a business, having tenant facing technology. So I think it's called straight to sofa. So essentially some of our technology now deals direct with the public, which probably wasn't so much the case for us as a business before, and it's changing the way we're then having to understand who our clients are, because it's very much the end user. But home swapper is what it says on the tin, really. If you're in a social house, you can apply to move into another one. And the requirement shift was rapid, almost instant. You went from a top 5, including sort of obviously central heating, double glazing was the top one, leading into COVID. And now no prizes for guessing what the top requirement now is. Could do a quick straw poll quiz, but it's gardens. Gardens are very much. So the outdoor space piece is where we're seeing a shift. But you'll be finding that in the private sector as well. I would think, you know, you can see that move from city to country has been well publicised, but it's definitely also true in social, without any question.
Brilliant. Thank you, Trevor. And I suspect lots of people there were shouting the word garden at their screens because I haven't quite yet worked out how to do a poll on Zoom. Moving on to the next topic. So what are the biggest threats to agency businesses in 2021? I'll probably say threats, challenges. You can interpret the question as you see fit, but Zoe, would you like to kick us off on that, please?
Yeah, I've got a bit of a list. I'm not trying to make everyone feel despairful, but obviously legislation that's coming in, potentially what might happen when the 9 million people on furlough, what you know, at the end of the furlough scheme, what's going to happen there is, are we going to see a massive rise in rent arrears? One of the things I would say is, if you're an agent out there and you offer rent guarantee insurance, now's the time to be selling it, just to protect your landlords. I'm not an insurance salesperson, but that's what I'm trying to do, just in case, because who knows. You've got landlords leaving the industry because they've had enough with the tax changes and all the legislation coming in. And then you've got the favourite phrase of mine, the race to the bottom, because landlords are becoming price sensitive. They're either going to go with the backstreet agents that aren't regulated, or do it themselves and not do it appropriately. We as agents on here need to be mindful of that and stand our ground and stand firm. So, you know, to make sure that we're not going to end up, you know, underselling people and selling people short. There are so many other things coming in as well. I'm sure David will allude to some of this. There's been massive talk about the Dogs and Domestic Animals Accommodation and Protection Bill. I'm sure David will probably say a few words about that. I think the Client Money Protection Rule deadline ends in April, does it, David? Yeah. And obviously there's the big debate about the EPC ratings, that obviously it's a few years away, but we should be thinking about that now and lobbying about that now, because if you think about all rental properties having to be a C or above, how many of your rental properties are actually going to meet that need? There's a few things just to keep you thinking.
Thanks, Zoe. I would say thanks. I think you probably disheartened some people, but we'll come on to some of the more positive stuff, I hope, as we go. David, what's your take?
I'll start with the positives. I don't think that the dogs and domestic violence bill, dogs and domestic pets bill, I can't remember its name even, will go anywhere. It's a 10-minute rule bill. It won't happen. There's been a lot of misreporting around this. I've seen loads of local press articles saying that landlords have to accept pets now, either based on this bill or a change to the government's model tenancy agreement. That is not the case. I do not think it will be the case. I really wouldn't worry about it. I should point out there is actually an old piece of statute that says that landlords do have to accept chickens and rabbits, and actually all no pets clauses technically you can't refuse tenants chickens and rabbits, but that's like a 1950s piece of legislation, and I don't think it's normally a problem. Most tenants don't want chickens and rabbits, apparently, although they should. More realistically, the two things that I think are a big deal this year. I already mentioned one of them. I think data protection potentially is a big deal for agents, and I think agents who haven't got privacy policies properly squared away need to get them squared away. Agents who have not got clear policies in terms of how they're handling data, how it's moving to and from people's homes, and what their employees are doing with it, need to get those squared away. Agents who haven't got clear policies about what their employees are allowed to access using computer systems and what they can look at on their employees' systems, and for example don't have policies around the use of WhatsApp and other social messaging systems, need to get those squared away before they get bitten by them. The other big thing that I do think is a big deal is the Northwood Solihull case, because the reality of that case is that as things currently stand, if you as an agent have signed a prescribed information certificate for a landlord, and you're a corporate agent, and you didn't have the signature as a director's signature witnessed by somebody else, which is basically nobody, because no one does that, then that prescribed information is defective. That means you can't serve a Section 21 notice. And it also means that the tenant can turn around and take a claim against you as the agent or the landlord, but they'll go for the agent for up to 3 times the deposit. So I am concerned about the possibility of a massive blast of claims hitting agents, because of course this isn't just going forward, this is the past. So these are all the deposit certificates you've signed in the last 6 years I'm talking about, not just ones that you did this week. And I think there's a real risk for some agents of a vast number of claims suddenly turning up, all for 3 times the deposit, which potentially could wipe somebody out of business if their insurance won't cover it. Now that case is being appealed. The tenants have appealed it to the Court of Appeal. I think the agent will probably cross appeal, but that's yet to be decided. And so this might resolve itself in the Court of Appeal, but people need to think carefully about deposit protection certificates and how they're going to manage those. And there is, I don't want to say this without dissing my own area of work. The reality is that the agents have business problems, so do other professionals. And that includes legal professionals. And that will mean that smaller firms who don't have alternative sources of business are turning away, for example, from RTAs, from road traffic accidents, because there haven't been any, and are looking for other types of bulk style claim that they can process. And one of the new big step areas are deposit claims and rent repayment orders, and people will pick them up and people will be looking for those claims. So those kind of processes around HMO licensing and things like that, improvement notices, things that lead to rent repayment orders, and the kind of things around that lead to deposit claims, agents need to make sure they are very, very hot on, because there will be people looking for those claims, and they will come. And they are solicitors. Sorry, that's the way the world is.
Thanks, David. So I guess just sort of picking up on one of the points that you went through there. If an agent has potentially missigned or incorrectly signed the appropriate certificates, ought they be speaking with their insurers now or is this something where they should wait for the outcome from the Court of Appeal, or should they just simply be, I guess, going back through and seeing quite how big a challenge they may have?
They may want to think about the challenge they've got. They may want to talk to some advisors. There's not much point in notifying your insurer because it's not a notifiable event until you have a claim. Obviously, if they're recent ones in the past 30 days, they can fix it. If they do a renewal, they can at least fix the renewal by serving the PI again on the renewal, because normally, of course, post-deregulation act, you don't have to reserve PI on renewals, but if the PI was defective the first time round, then you should, because otherwise you're basically increasing your liability on every renewal. And I suppose they could re-sign the PI and just send it out without with other documentation, without saying anything, in the hope that nobody notices, as long as they don't fraudulently do that and misstate the signatures and suggest that it's what it originally looked like. There's no reason why people couldn't re-sign that PI and send it out again. So at least it was right going forward, which would mean, of course, that they could serve a Section 21 notice validly for as long as we have such a thing. But there's not a lot that you can do about ex post facto claims. I mean, for the past, I mean, the only two ways they're going to be fixed are an appeal to the Court of Appeal, which succeeds on this point. That's open to dispute. I mean, there is a problem with Northwood Solihull. It is wrongly decided. With the High Court misconstrued the law very obviously in that, and that gives a good avenue for an appeal. And the other option, of course, is that the government could fix it, but they would have to do so in primary legislation, just like they did with Super Strike, for those of you who remember Super Strike, in the Deregulation Act. And of course, the original plan was to do that with the Renters Reform Bill, but the Renters Reform Bill is a little bit in the long grass at the moment till the end of the year, and therefore realistically isn't likely to come into force until the latter part of 2022 at best. So it's a bit too far off really for fixing. We probably need a sooner fix, and the Court of Appeal is now the only real avenue for that. And we'll have to see what happens. I mean, the Court of Appeal has been kind to landlords recently. In Carroll and Roundsfield, they bent over backwards, frankly, to solve the gas safety certificate problem. They didn't have to do that. I know people probably won't see it that way, but the Court of Appeal really, really hoped the law around pretty massively to bail landlords out on that one. So we'll have to hope to do it again.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. And thank you to everyone who's submitted the questions so far. So they're being consolidated into themes. If there's something you'd like to add to provide some, I guess, commentary, insights, or even the questions, please hit on the Q&A button at the top. Trevor, what do you think the biggest challenge for agents is over the coming year?
I mean, I'm at risk of repeating myself. This damper from rent, and therefore this sort of squeeze on fees that I mentioned at the start, where that's then going to have a knock-on effect through the business in terms of how you're best allocating resources. So if I was to offer one piece of advice really around that, would be look at processes again. Look at where you may have done something in a particular way for a very long time and it seems to work, and decided it is actually the right way to do it. It's probably an ideal time to do it. As we come off the back of this pandemic and we start to talk about how we're going to work going forward, then that would be a potentially scary thing to do. Look at the business, see what everyone's up to. Some of the better agents I'm talking to have really just sort of stepped into the business on a day-to-day basis and said, okay, why do we do things a certain way? Why do we use certain bits of kit? Why do we employ certain people to do certain processes? Should we change that? And don't be afraid of reallocating resource to work in a more efficient way, really.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I'm conscious of time and want to leave enough time for questions. I've got a couple of things that I'd just like to quickly go through with all of you before we turn to the audience questions. So when we were planning this webinar, I think we had a pretty clear steer from the press and from I think it was the Office of Tax Simplification, that changes were coming down the line, including in respects of CGT, and that may have a big impact as the pandemic has continued and economic malaise has continued. I think that there is less certainty about what's going to come out of the budget. But I guess briefly, Zoe, do you have any views on what the prospective tax changes that were being mooted? Let's call it the end of the stamp duty holiday and a potential convergence of CGT rates and income tax rates. What's your take on that for your landlord base?
I'm not a massive tax expert, but obviously just on, the fact that, capital gains tax rates could be doubled, and exemptions to be cut to raise money, that is landlords are going to have bigger tax bills. So they're going to take a view. Now, they're either going to leave, or they're going to, we're talking about fees again. They're not going to, they're going to try and cut costs wherever they can. And that could be potentially stepping away from the legitimate, compliant, hardworking agents that we all are to, we're talking about the race to the bottom. I think, potentially that could happen. It's very, very difficult to know with all of the things that are happening at the moment, whether that will be the case. But I honestly think landlords will be reviewing their options. I mean, one of the things I would say is for the agents out there, if you've got independent financial advisors that could potentially be advising your clients now, maybe it's the time where you could then, as an agency, earn a little bit of extra income on the back of it as well.
Thanks, Zoe. And David, I realise it's pretty speculative at the moment. It feels like different briefings are going out on different days. But what's your take?
Well, if I take my lawyer hat off for a moment and talk as someone who's worked in the policy side of the PRS for quite some time as well, let's be blunt. The Treasury considers and has long considered landlords as the golden goose that will keep on giving. And the simple reality of that is that they've tended to be right, actually. There's no particular evidence that previous tax increases, including the much loathed reduction of mortgage interest relief, substantially led to landlords leaving the sector. It led to a number of landlords converting their properties either to short lets, which they've now converted back in most cases, or entering into company arrangements in order to recover that ability. But there's no particular evidence, and we studied this when I was at the RLA. We just couldn't find any evidence that really supported the fact that landlords were disappearing en masse. CGT change, the reality is again that the government's not likely to recover as much money as it thinks from CGT because it relies on landlords having made a significant profit. Not all landlords will in fact have made a large capital gain on their property. It depends when they bought it and where the market was at the time. Again, the RLA looked at it when I was there, and we found that in a lot of cases landlords wouldn't make a profit because they bought it at actually quite high in the market, and the properties hadn't increased in value all that much. And of course, the other point is, of course, you're going to pay CGT if you sell it. So arguably, it leads to landlords not selling and staying in the market because then they have to pay the CGT. So there's some question about what CGT will do. I mean, the one thing that if I was the Chancellor, I would be thinking about pushing up the 3% stamp duty land tax uplift, frankly. And I would push it to 4% because the 3% uplift made the Treasury a fortune. They were expecting somewhere around 400 million, and they got 1.5 billion out of it in the first year. So they did 3 times as well out of it as they expected. If I was them, I would push that to 4%. But I'm not saying they will, I hasten to add, but that's what I would do if I was the Chancellor, frankly. I think landlords should expect that they will end up paying more tax because the Treasury has got to find money somewhere, and they will take the view that the PRS is an easy target. No doubt that will be pushed against, but unfortunately, so far the stats are on the Treasury's side, so it's really, really difficult to push back against. Sorry.
Thank you, David. I'm glad you're not in the Treasury, because I dislike the idea of a stamp duty rise on landlords. So
I'm nowhere near clever enough to work for the Treasury.
So again, recognizing that the questions are coming in thick and fast, so just sort of, I guess, bullet points on this. What's the most important thing agents can do to make sure they protect and grow their profitability over the next year? Zoe?
Well, I've got bullet points, so I'll be quick. First thing, there's no silver bullet. You need to be reviewing all your costs and streamline. Use what you really need. There needs to be a balance between the people and the tech, and the tech should never replace the people too much. You need to still communicate, have a plan. Far too often, business owners end up working in the business rather than on it, and you need to have a full understanding of how your business operates. Okay, at the grassroots level you do, but you need to take a step back and strategically plan where you're going for the next 12 months. Like I said, get your systems in place, get your staff and yourself qualified. Yes, Roper's a long way off, but if you want to be the market leader in this industry, you want to be first, to say, shouting from the rooftops that you're qualified. Don't sink back into your old ways once we come out the other side of this. Let's carry on communicating and being positive and being effective with the agencies, and work with people like Arla Property Mart, Safe Agent. Somebody I haven't mentioned yet, but the Letting Industry Council is a real effective tool to get information. They also lobby government, and they have a lot of documentation and paperwork in place that as an agency you could be looking at. The unique property reference number, the property MOTs. They're also trying to lobby at the moment about EPCs. Check out their website, because it's useful information, and you can also join their meetings, which are very, very informative and useful.
Amazing. Thank you, Zoe. David, what's your take on what agents can be doing over the next year?
Yeah, so I don't think the rules of business have changed. So my starting point with all of this is what I would always say: what's your USP? What is it about you that makes you worthwhile to landlords? Agents spend far too much time in practice advertising against other agents, in the same sense as that cigarette manufacturers purport to spend, or used to purport, of course, to this band, to spend their advertising dollar on advertising to get people to switch rather than take up smoking, which wasn't true. That's what they used to say. Agents need to focus on why landlords shouldn't be doing it themselves and should be using an agent, and what makes them unique in that sector. And then don't do stuff that distracts from delivering on your USP. A lot of agents say they've got a USP and then they distract from it massively. So focus is vital. And I say that's a general business principle. The other big business principle that I think is worth bearing in mind is that not every client is actually worth having. Far too many agents, I often say to agents when I'm talking to them, say, why don't you just get rid of this person? They're not worth it. And they're like, oh, I can't get rid of a client. But there's a rule that's well known in business called the 80-20 rule, which says 80% of your money comes from 20% of your clients, 20% of your time spent comes from, 80% of your time spent comes from 20% of your clients. You need to be reducing the latter and increasing the former. There are some clients who are not worth having, especially as you're being paid on commission. Yeah, if they're messing you around about putting the property on the market, if they obstruct your management, they may not be worth having because they're costing you money. So I think people need to think carefully about who it is they want, and then be ruthless in getting rid of clients who don't fit their profile. That may also mean taking a tight view about what type of sector you're in. And for example, not dealing with higher value property. If your business is about mid-range property, there's sometimes an aspect in which agents just think, I'll take any property that comes through the door. That's just not sensible. And then the last thing is tech. And prop tech is useful, and I agree with, and I'm generally a fan of prop tech. What I do think people need to think about is making sure their prop tech ties together. You see far too many agents who have got whizzy pieces of prop tech, none of which speak to each other, or they could if they invested the money to make them talk to each other. And then they're spending money basically on getting people to type stuff from one piece of prop tech into the next piece of prop tech, which is one, asking for you to make a mistake. And if it's a bad mistake, that may well lead to a GDPR problem. For example, typing the email address in wrongly and sending it to the wrong person is a classic mistake that leads to problems. And it basically means that the prop tech investment is often entirely obviated by the extra resource effort in typing stuff around. So prop tech good, yes. make sure your prop tech actually talks to each other and works together.
Amazing. Thank you very much. It feels like you've just done Trevor's MRI pitch on his behalf. But Trevor, I'm going to ask you to leave MRI to one side and ask you what do you think agents can do to protect and grow their profitability?
Yeah, I mean, it's I won't carry on the integration piece because I could talk all day, as you know. But the two elements from what the guy's just been talking about there. But I mean, don't go for the shiny is the big headline one. Just don't. There are so many solutions we see day in, day out that seem to fit a need, which they do, but they're shiny. They don't integrate. You get this chair spinning, as you say, which then generates potential GDPR issues. So yeah, just stay away from some of this sort of stuff that look, it's just noise. And you know, we see day in, day out, there are loads of solutions. The ones that work are the ones that grow where they start from. So they do tend to deliver a solution to a particular need in the market, and then they evolve and they become better at actually meeting other needs and helping with other issues. So that's what you want to see in prop tech providers, that kind of growth of helping the tenant, helping the agent on the journey. So you mentioned UPRN, that's going to be huge. And it's funny, the lack of interest there seems to be around unique property reference numbers, because that's going to drive a huge amount of movement, hopefully forward, in terms of that ability to get technology talking to each other. So, you know, we see that as a massive driver that we've got to get into and get much more behind. At the moment, just capturing UPRN, so what? You know, it's taking that and then making that work across the piece when it comes to your technology. So yeah, ignore the shiny. There's loads of it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And now we're into the audience questions, of which there are a lot. And so I'm going to try and break these into themes, dealing with hopefully some of the sort of more bullet pointy ones first. So for David, how could the debt respite scheme affect a real estate agency?
Well, I think it probably depends. I mean, I know everyone doesn't agree with me on this, but I actually think potentially it's quite positive. I know people will be screaming at their screens now in disagreement. The fact of the matter is that what currently happens is tenants fall into rent arrears and they then see it as a one-way street. They don't pay the money because they think they're going to get evicted, and it's usually never collected. It's almost impossible to collect this money. So the debt respite scheme is supposed to enable a scenario whereby tenants can get a pause on their current debts, although I hasten to add they still have to pay the rent going forward during the breathing space, which is 60 days. And then the idea is that they will enter into a debt solution, so some kind of arrangement to pay their debts off. Not necessarily all of their debts, but a significant percentage of them. One would assume, otherwise people are just not going to enter into a solution. So potentially it could work quite well in the sense of encouraging tenants to stay on their property and pay their rent, with the hope of entering into a debt solution with their landlords over the longer term to get them to pay off their arrears and remain in place. Now, in truth, I don't see that as a bad thing for the sector. I see that as generally positive, save for people who specialise in evicting tenants, I guess. Which you know, so obviously cry a tear for your lawyer, but apart from that, I don't see that as a bad thing. I mean, could it be abused by unscrupulous tenants and debt advice services? Yes, but debt advice services are regulated, and I don't think that will be a huge thing. In practice, I don't think that many tenants will actually be able to enter into a breathing space in the private rented sector. I think it'll be relatively limited. But post-COVID, it might be a positive thing in terms of tenants who have got into COVID debt, but are getting back into employment and potentially can work their way out of that. And clearly the government was going to have to do something about aspects of burgeoning debt caused by COVID, because the only other options were to write off all rent arrears statutorily, which wasn't going to be popular, or start bunging loans at tenants and landlords, which works all right in Wales and Scotland, which are basically tiny in comparison in terms of PRS size, but wasn't realistic in England.
Thanks, David. Questions coming for Zoe. So Zoe, you mentioned about the upcoming changes to EPCs and minimum energy standards within properties. Could you just sort of summarize when do EPCs have to be C or above? And a second point that came in, I guess it's the theme, is this actually going to happen?
I can't tell you if it's going to happen. That might be more for David. But 2025 is new tenancies, and 2028 is all tenancies, as far as I know. They are, like I said, there are people lobbying as we speak, but David might be better placed to know whether or not there'll be any changes and whether it actually will happen.
Is that an invitation to respond? It will happen. The government's got to do it. The government cannot meet its claimed targets, both originally to the EU and also in the Paris Climate Accords, without improving residential property. Residential property is actually one of our biggest carbon producing areas, especially at the moment, because people spend a lot of time at home. So we have got to improve it. The issue, of course, is not so much that we have to get to a C, but how we get there, the timeline for getting there, and what exemptions we allow. And that's really the issue of the most recent consultation, which closed on the 8th of January, is been exploring. The current position is that people should probably wait to the response to that consultation. I mean, there's an argument for getting on with it now, but I would probably hold off, because on the previous move to an E, if you went too early, the money that you spent, you couldn't then use to claim an exemption. And there's likely to be an exemption threshold again. It's currently, the government's pushing for 10,000, but obviously smaller numbers have been put forward in various consultation responses, which I'm not at liberty to discuss. So don't spend your money too soon. It's probably a little bit of a watch this space until the response comes, which will probably be in the summer.
Thank you. David, we've had quite a lot of questions on the Northwood Solihull case. Rather than running through it, because I'm conscious of time and some of the other themes that have come up, have you written an article that you could point people in the direction of, or can we co-write one to go through the questions?
I've got a blog post on it on my website, which I actually put in an answer to one of the Q&As. I know Zoe's and I've both been frantically typing answers to some of these questions to cut the limit down. I mean, the summary position is very quickly that where a corporate entity has signed the prescribed information, corporate entity, then the current state of play is that should have been signed by a director before a witness, in the same sense as that a corporate entity must sign either by a director before a witness, or two directors, or one director and one company secretary, which I'm sure most people have heard of in relation to tenancy agreements. If you haven't done that, then that prescribed information is defective, with all the normal consequences that flow from that. So not being able to service Section 21 until you fix it, and potentially being liable for the claim of up to 3 times the tenancy deposit. But it's being disputed at the moment. But yeah, I have written a blog post on it. I've put it into the Q&A in response to somebody's question, and I'm sure we can put it on the follow-up as well.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Trevor, I know that you're active across, your business is active across the student market. So what is your take on how, I'm getting strange feedback, how the student market is affecting letting agents?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't know whether we've actually done any broad analysis around, whether it's had a huge impact, because obviously students have had to return, they're back in residence, so it certainly doesn't seem to be a systemic issue across the large university towns that we're seeing more arrears or more issues with students, individual pockets potentially, but certainly we don't see it as a major factor in terms of affecting passing rent and landlords noticing that obviously they're not getting occupancy.
Thank you. Got a couple of, sorry, Trevor, would you mind just putting yourself on mute for a second? I'm getting some feedback. two quick questions for David before we have to end. The first is a number of agents are getting written confirmations from tenants that they will not give access to an EICR engineer, and I suspect it will be the same for a gas safe engineer. Is there anything else that they can be doing other than getting those confirmations in writing to avail themselves of any form of defence?
Yeah, first thing I should say is it's not a defence. So you need to keep pushing. I mean, in the same sense, there's no actual defence to a gas safety certificate. It's just that the health and safety executive has a policy on prosecution. Clearly, I would get those. Whether the local authority will accept them is another matter. The only thing I would say is keep pressing. You want to show at least 3 attempts to gain access. If a tenant's saying they won't let you in because of COVID, get it in writing. But then keep pressing them as the situation improves.
So thank you, Zoe. I saw you raised your hand there.
I just sort of wanted to add to that. It's always about keeping an audit trail. But one of the things I've done individually is I liaise with the local authority, because if you build a positive relationship with them, it's less likely it's going to come back on you further down the line.
Right, thank you. And I've just got the final question that I'd like to put to you, Zoe, which is how do you think the industry is going to deal with tenants who've got into rent arrears or difficulties over this period through the referencing process? So let's sort of fast forward a year and hope that the world is a more normal place. Do you have any views on how people who got into rent challenges over this period would be viewed, whether by an agency or by the referencing companies? Have you seen anything or thought about that?
There's actually been nothing specific about that. And I think one of the interesting things, though, for me has been what I would say is people that are getting into rent arrears, and I don't know if I've just been really lucky, are what I would call the usual suspects. And agents listening today will know exactly what I mean by the usual suspects. I say out of my portfolio, I've got 1 tenant who's in arrears due to being furloughed as a result of COVID. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to shake out. References companies haven't said anything to date. And I think, again, it's probably down to the fact that we're not really quite sure how this is all going to shake out. I think the biggest issue for some is going to be the amount of arrears that maybe has cropped up. I mean, if you speak to someone like Paul Champlina about some of the cases he's dealing with in the phenomenal amount of rent arrears that was already in place pre-COVID and what that is going to equate to now, it beggars belief. And I think I go back to anyone that can get some rent guarantee insurance. Okay, it might cost you a few £100, but it just takes that worry away from you.
Speaking as a landlord, we took out a policy last week. I guess as we wrap up, is there anything you would like to share with the audience before we go? Zoe, what's your takeaway points?
Just quickly, I just want to say the cream will rise to the top. Get your staff qualified, get your processes in place, and carry on communicating with your clients. Thank you. David?
Stick with it, stay flexible, keep looking for good sources of information. 2021, I'm afraid, is going to be a bit more like 2020. It'll be more of the same for a while yet, but things will get better. And as Zoe says, good agents will remain good agents, and this is your time to shine.
Thank you, David. And Trevor?
Yeah, a quick amusing story. The reason you had feedback earlier is that my Google Home started to recite the Northwood Solihull case to me, just randomly. So I know all about that now. I don't, David, believe me. Listen, all is not lost, right? You know, I'm 53. I know I don't look it, but adaptation, adapt, evolve, survive is a bit of a cliche, but that's exactly what you need to do and hopefully can do as we go through this. 53 years old, I'm not going to say, the R word, we're not going to go into recession, I'm sure, but if it does happen, if we do see a downturn, it'll be the 4th one I've weathered the storm of, 87, late 90s, 2001, we had a bit of a dip in 2009. Everything's going to be fine, guys. People have got to live somewhere. So, yeah, adapt, evolve, survive. It'll be fine.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm really grateful to everyone on the panel, so to Zoe, David and Trevor for giving up their time and sharing their expertise, and to everyone in the audience for giving up time to be with us today. There are a couple of really important things to just run through. So the first is you'll receive a copy of or a link to the recording of the webinar. Please do feel free to share that with colleagues or friends in the industry who you think might find it interesting. And we now have a YouTube channel. So if you think that this sort of thing is interesting and may have missed some of the webinars in the past, including some of the cases that David mentioned in passing, they should all now be there on our YouTube channel. And please do get in touch via our social media channels. Finally, our next webinar is coming up in a few weeks. It's a PRS policy chat on what's next for agents and landlords with David Cox, who's now the Legal and Compliance Director at Rightmove. And I think I think it'll be generally interesting, but if there are any questions that you have in advance, please do let us know. Once again, thank you to everyone very much for attending today. And I wish you a safe and not so frosty day. Thank you very much. Bye.